The snow did not fall in flakes but in needles, a hard, dry sift that the wind used to scour the world clean. It drove parallel to the ground, erasing the line between earth and sky. Through this colorless tumult moved a figure, dark and slow, a smudge of soot against a whitewashed wall. Agnes did not look up. The sky held nothing for her. Her world had been reduced to the next step, and the one after that. 70 years had bent her spine into a question mark, but her feet, wrapped in layers of burlap over worn leather, found the frozen earth with a certainty that had outlived everything else. In the crook of her left arm, she held the only warmth she had been allowed to keep. A ball of grey fur, a cat named Tinder, who had burrowed into the folds of her wool coat and did not stir. His small weight was an anchor in the gale. The house was gone. Not burned, not fallen, but erased from her life as surely as the wind erased her tracks. The door, made of pine her own husband had felled and planed 40 years prior, had closed with a quiet click. No slam, no shout. The violence was in the quiet. Her son-in-law, Martin, had stood on the threshold, his face scrubbed of all expression. He was a man who believed feeling was a form of waste. Behind him, her daughter, Helen, a ghost in her own home, had stared at a point on the floor. The child, Lydia, her face a pale miniature of her mother's, had started to raise a hand. Martin had placed his own hand on her shoulder, a gentle pressure that pinned her in place. "It is for the best, Agnes," he had said, his voice as flat and cold as a river stone. "There is not enough room. Not enough food. It is the practical thing practical." The word was a scalpel. He had used it to cut her out of the life she had built. She had not argued. Arguing with Martin was like arguing with a rock slide. He had already calculated the trajectory, the cost, the final resting place of all the pieces. She had only nodded, turned, and walked away from the smell of baking bread and the sight of her own grandchild's silenced farewell. Now, the wind was her only companion. It spoke a language she understood, a language of brutal, honest necessity. It did not pretend to be practical. It was simply a force, and she was simply a body, moving against it. She found it not by sight but by feel. A change in the wind's voice. It no longer screamed in her ear but whispered over her head. She looked up, squinting against the driving snow, and saw it, a dark brow of granite, an overhang on the leeward side of a low ridge that ran like a fossilized spine across the prairie. The wind, hitting the rock face, was forced upward, creating a pocket of relative calm below. It was not a cave, not a home, but it was a start. It was a place to stop walking. She lowered herself to the ground, her knees cracking in protest, and unwrapped Tinder. The cat, stiff with cold, blinked his green eyes, a startling flash of color in the monochrome world. He took a tentative step, then another, before retreating to the shelter of her skirts. Agnes ran a hand, gnarled and chapped, over his back. The vibration of his purr was a distant engine, a sign of life in the frozen machine of the world. She took stock. The space was perhaps 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, the rock ceiling sloping down to meet a floor of frozen scree. It was open to the east, a gaping mouth that invited the weather in. That would have to be closed. Her mind, which Martin had dismissed as clouded by age, began to work. It was a familiar process, like mapping out a quilt pattern or planning a winter pantry. A problem was a set of shapes to be arranged. She needed walls. She needed a hearth. She needed wood. She needed a way to make the wind an ally, not an enemy. In her pocket, her fingers found a small, smooth stone, worn to a soft gloss by a lifetime of anxious rubbing. It was from the hearth of the house she had just left. She had scooped it from the ash bucket that morning, a habit without a reason, and now it was all she had of that place. It was heavy in her hand. Not a memory. An anchor. She laid it carefully on a flat ledge of rock. This would be the center. Everything would be built around it. For the rest of the afternoon, she worked, gathering the skeletal remains of last summer's brush, snapping dry, dead branches from the low-slung junipers that clung to the rock face. The pile grew slowly. It was a task of 1,000 small efforts. Each stick was a victory. As dusk began to bleed purple into the gray, she had enough for a small, brief fire. She built it carefully, a small cone of tinder and kindling, and struck a precious lucifer match against the dry rock. The flame sputtered, then caught. It was a tiny, defiant star in the immense darkness. She and the cat huddled close, sharing its meager warmth, watching the shadows dance on the stone wall behind them. The world was still a brutal, indifferent place. But in this small circle of light, for this one night, it was held at bay. The next days were a blur of labor. The cold was a physical presence, a thief that stole the heat from her muscles and the dexterity from her fingers. Each morning she woke before dawn, her body a single, unified ache, and set to work. The first task was a wall. She found a stand of willows in a shallow gully, their whips thin and pliable even when frozen. Using the small hatchet Martin had grudgingly allowed her, she cut dozens of them, dragging them back to the shelter. She drove the thickest ends into the frozen ground, a line of stakes that defined the edge of her new world. Then, she began to weave. Her hands, which had braided her daughter's hair and woven rag rugs for 40 years, knew the rhythm. Over, under, over, under. The motion was automatic, a prayer of the hands. Slowly, a lattice of wood grew, a porous screen against the wind. It was not enough. Insulation was the principle of survival. It was true for a house, for a body, for a heart. You trapped the air, held the warmth inside layers of stillness. She spent 2 days gathering dry prairie grass and pine boughs, stuffing the coarse material into the gaps in her willow wall. Then came the sod. The ground was frozen solid, but near the base of the ridge, where the sun had a purchase for a few hours each day, the top layer had a slight give. She hacked at it with the hatchet, peeling back the turf in thick, heavy rectangles. She laid these against the outer wall, grass side in, building a thick, earthen barrier. The work was brutal. Her breath came in white plumes, her back screamed, and her hands were raw. She worked until she could not, then rested by the fire, eating from the small sack of dried apples and hardtack she'd been given as a parting gift. A charity that felt like another twist of the knife. Tinder watched her, a silent, judgmental foreman, occasionally leaving the fireside to hunt for the mice that lived in the rockfall, returning with a small, grim offering that she dutifully cooked and shared with him. He was a better provider than her own kin. She did not allow herself to think of them. To think of Helen's averted eyes or Martin's placid cruelty was a waste of heat. Grief was a luxury. She had a wall to finish. The hearth was the heart. A house was just a box against the weather until it had a fire at its center. This she knew. The memory of her husband, Thomas, rose in her not as a ghost but as a set of instructions. He had been a quiet man, a builder, not a talker. He spoke in the language of plumb lines and level stones. A chimney draws on difference, he'd told her once, watching the smoke from his pipe curl towards the ceiling. Hot air wants to rise, cold air wants to fall. You just give them a road to follow. She searched the scree field for the right stones, flat, broad pieces of schist for the base, thicker blocks of granite for the walls. She carried them one by one, her body straining against the weight. Each stone was a penance and a promise. She laid the foundation directly on the rock floor, a wide, stable rectangle. Then she began to build the firebox, 3 walls of carefully chosen rock. The hardest part was the chimney. It had to rise through a natural fissure in the rock overhang. It needed to be sealed tight, so it would draw properly and not fill her small space with smoke. For this, she needed mortar. She found a deposit of clay down by the creek bed, a seam of grey, greasy earth. She hacked it out in frozen chunks and thawed it by the fire, mixing it with sand and dried grass to make a thick, sticky daub. Her hands, caked in the cold mud, felt ancient. She was no longer a woman. She was a creature of earth and stone. She packed the daub between the chimney stones, smoothing it with her palms, her fingers tracing the path the smoke would take. It was an act of faith. When it was done, she stood back, her body trembling with exhaustion. It was a crude thing, lopsided and rough, but it was hers. She built a fire inside it, laying the kindling with the care of a priestess arranging an altar. She struck the match. The smoke hesitated, a grey ghost in the firebox, then, as the air in the flue warmed, it seemed to make a decision. It streamed upwards, a clean, straight line into the fissure and out into the winter sky. A perfect draw. She sank to the floor, a single tear freezing on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of grim, hard-won victory. She had made a road for the smoke. She had made a heart for her house. One morning, a man appeared at the edge of her clearing. He stood as still as the winter-stripped aspens, a tall, lean figure wrapped in furs, his face obscured by a thick, greying beard. He did not approach, just watched. Tinder, perched on the wall, hissed low in his throat. Agnes felt a prickle of fear, the old vulnerability of a woman alone. But she did not reach for the hatchet. She simply met his gaze and waited. He carried no rifle she could see. His stillness was not threatening, it was observational, like a hawk assessing a field. After a long silence, he took a few steps forward, his eyes taking in the wall, the stacked firewood, the thin plume of smoke rising from the rock. He stopped 10 feet from her. "Chimney draws clean," he said. His voice was gravelly, unused. She just nodded. He looked at the woven willow, the tightly packed sod. He nudged a piece of the turf with the toe of his boot. Insulated, it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of recognition. "It is," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a space where things were understood without being said. He knew what this place was. He knew what it had cost to build it. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, dark object. He tossed it, and it landed softly in the snow at her feet. It was a whetstone. "Blades dull," he said, gesturing with his chin toward her hatchet. "Dull tools a dangerous tool." Then he turned and walked away, melting back into the trees as silently as he had arrived. His name, she would learn later, was Saul. He was a trapper, a man who had left the world of towns and people behind long ago. He never stayed long, never said much. But every few days, he would leave something at the edge of her camp, a snare made of fine wire, a small bundle of dried herbs, a piece of cured deer hide that was softer and warmer than any wool. He never offered to help. He never pitied her. He simply saw her work, recognized the craft in it, and offered a tool to make it better. His presence was a quiet confirmation. It told her she was not a mad old woman dying in the wilderness. She was a builder. And he, another builder, recognized the work. Life settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the cold. The shelter, once a desperate improvisation, became a home. She used the deer hide Saul had left her to make a flap for the entrance, weighted with stones. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth kept the space warm enough. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and damp earth. It was the smell of survival. She built a bed in the corner, a raised platform of woven willow boughs covered with a deep mattress of pine needles and dried grass. It was more comfortable than any feather bed she had ever known. She organized her small world with meticulous care. Firewood was stacked by size and dryness. Her meager food supply, the last of the hardtack, the dried meat and herbs from Saul, the occasional snared rabbit, was stored on a high rock shelf, safe from mice. She kept a journal, a small leather-bound book she had tucked into her pocket before leaving. On its pages, she did not write of her feelings. She wrote of facts. December 12th, snowfall, 3 inches. Temperature at dawn, 4 degrees. Wind from the northwest. Snared 1 rabbit. Tinder is well. The act of recording the world was an act of mastering it. It turned the terrifying, chaotic force of winter into a series of measurable events. She was not its victim, she was its observer. She learned the subtle language of the landscape. She knew which trees held the driest wood, where the snowdrifts would be deepest, which animal tracks belonged to a predator and which to prey. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of ridge and gully, but within it, her knowledge had grown immense. She felt her body changing. The constant work had hardened her muscles. The fat she had carried into winter had melted away, leaving a lean, wiry strength. Her mind, too, felt sharper, pared down to what was essential. There was no room for bitterness. Bitterness was a dead weight. There was only the task at hand, to live through the day, to be warm through the night, to wake up and do it all again. It was not happiness. It was something more fundamental. It was purpose. The blizzard arrived without warning. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind began to moan, a low, rising note that vibrated in the rock itself. Agnes had seen enough winters to know this was no mere squall. This was a siege. She brought the last of the firewood inside, stacking it against the back wall until it nearly touched the ceiling. She checked the seals on her chimney, packing fresh clay into any cracks. She dropped the heavy hide flap over the entrance and secured it with a log. Then, there was nothing to do but wait. The world outside dissolved into a roaring whiteness. The wind shrieked, a physical force that pressed against her sod wall, seeking entry. Snow, fine as sand, found its way through invisible cracks, dusting the floor in pale drifts. The temperature inside the shelter began to drop. The fire, which had been her steadfast heart, seemed to shrink, its flames cowering low. She fed it stick by stick, conserving her fuel, knowing it had to last. Tinder, who usually slept soundly, paced the small space, his tail twitching, his ears flat against his head. The sound was immense, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through her bones. It was the sound of the world trying to tear itself apart. Fear, a cold, sharp thing she had managed to keep at bay, began to creep in. She felt the immensity of her own solitude, the thinness of the walls she had built against the rage of the continent. She was a single, fragile spark in an infinite, frozen darkness. To fight the fear, she worked. She took the last of her twine and wove a net of it across the inside of the willow wall, reinforcing it. She used her own worn shawl to plug the draft that snaked in under the door flap. Every small action was a defiance. The storm lasted 2 days and 3 nights. She did not sleep. She dozed in fits, huddled by the fire, her hand on the cat's warm, living body. She listened to the storm, learning its rhythms, its moments of peak fury and its brief, deceptive lulls. On the 3rd morning, she woke to a profound silence. The wind had stopped. The world was utterly still. She pushed aside the door flap and looked out. The landscape was unrecognizable, buried under a monolithic drift of white. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. She had survived. The shelter had held. She looked at her rough walls, her simple hearth. They were not just wooden stone and mud. They were a testament. She had built a thing that no winter could break. A week after the blizzard, she saw a figure struggling through the deep snow. It was not Saul. This person was small, clumsy, falling every few steps. As they drew closer, Agnes recognized the shape of a child. Then she recognized the red wool coat. It was Lydia. Her heart, which she had thought frozen into a hard, practical knot, clenched. The child was alone. She was half frozen, her face blue with cold, her breathing a ragged, shallow rasp. Agnes ran to her, gathering the small, shivering body in her arms. Lydia did not fight. She collapsed against her, a dead weight. Behind her, struggling to keep up, was another figure. Beth, a neighbor from the town, a woman who had stood by and watched when Martin had closed the door. Beth's face was a mask of desperation and shame. "It's the lung fever," Beth gasped, her words coming out in puffs of steam. "The town doctor is gone. Martin. He wouldn't come himself. He sent me," the unspoken words hung in the air. "He sent her to you because he has nowhere else to turn." Agnes did not waste time on irony. She carried Lydia inside and laid her by the fire. The child's skin was hot and dry. Her chest rattled with every breath. Agnes knew this fever. She had seen it take children before. She went to the high shelf and took down the bundles of herbs Saul had left her. Mullein for the lungs. Willow bark for the fever. Yarrow to make her sweat. She brewed a dark, bitter tea, forcing it drop by drop between Lydia's cracked lips. For 3 days, she did not leave the child's side. She bathed her in cool water, changed her damp clothes, and kept the tea coming. She sat through the long nights, listening to the child's labored breathing, feeling the fragile life flicker and wane. Beth stayed, a useless, guilty spectator. She tried to help, but her hands were clumsy. She mostly just sat in the corner, weeping quietly. "I'm sorry, Agnes," she whispered once, in the dead of night. "We shouldn't have listened to him." "We were afraid." Agnes did not answer. Forgiveness was an abstraction. The only thing that was real was the child's feverish body and the steady work of her own 2 hands. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Lydia woke up, her eyes clear for the first time. She looked around the small, warm shelter, at the stone walls and the smoky ceiling. Her eyes fell on Agnes. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice weak. Agnes smoothed the hair back from her forehead. "I'm here." The story of the child's recovery traveled faster than the winter wind. It came back to the town not as a tale of forgiveness, but as a tale of competence. The old woman they had cast out possessed a knowledge they had lost. The first to come was Owen, the blacksmith. He was a large, practical man who did not deal in sentiment. He arrived not with apologies, but with a problem. He brought a piece of warped steel and a question about tempering. He stood awkwardly in her shelter, his large frame filling the space, and looked at her chimney with a professional eye. "Good draft," he noted. "My own forge smokes when the wind is from the east." They talked for an hour about heat and airflow and the properties of clay. He listened to her, his initial skepticism melting into a grudging respect. Before he left, he looked at her high door flap. "That won't last another season," he said. "I'll make you a proper door." With hinges, he was true to his word. A week later, he returned with a solid plank door and a set of heavy iron hinges. He helped her fit it into the opening, his skill a perfect complement to her own. The door closed with a satisfying thud, shutting out the wind completely for the first time. It was a gift of respect, not charity. Others followed. Women from the town began to make the trek to her ridge, bringing small gifts of flour or salt, and leaving with bundles of dried herbs and advice on colic or coughs. They did not speak of what had happened. They did not need to. Their presence was its own apology. Then came Preacher Collins. He had sanctioned her removal, speaking from the pulpit about the duty of a community to be practical, to shed its burdens. He stood before her now, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a conflict he could no longer ignore. "I was wrong, Agnes," he said, the words costing him dearly. "I spoke of practicality, but I forgot about wisdom. I forgot about strength." She did not offer him absolution. She simply nodded, accepting the fact of his admission. The next Sunday, he preached a sermon about the stone that the builders rejected. He did not use her name. He didn't have to. The entire town knew who he was talking about. She had not sought justice, but it had come to find her, not in a courtroom, but in the slow, turning tide of community respect. Spring arrived slowly, a gradual softening at the edges of the world. The snow receded, revealing the pale, sleeping earth beneath. The creek began to flow again, its voice a happy murmur. Agnes felt the change in her own bones. The harsh, brittle focus of winter gave way to a quieter, more expansive state of mind. She cleared a small patch of ground near the shelter and began a garden, planting the seeds some of the townswomen had brought her. One afternoon, Martin came. He walked up the path alone, without Lydia, without Helen. He stood where Owen and the preacher had stood, but he looked smaller, diminished by the space she had created. He looked at the solid door, the neat garden plot, the well-tended path. He saw not a hovel, but a homestead. He did not look her in the eye. "Helen misses you," he said to the ground. "Lydia asks for you. The house is quiet." The silence stretched. Agnes waited, tending a small sprout with her fingers. She would not help him. He had to find the words himself. "There is room now," he said finally. You could come back. She stood up then and wiped the dirt from her hands. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in months. She saw not a monster, but a man terrified of losing control, a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength. There was no hatred in her, only a vast, calm distance. No, she said. The word was not angry. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the stone wall behind her. This is my home now. He seemed to shrink further. He had no more arguments. His practicality had no answer to this. He nodded once, a jerky, defeated motion, and turned to leave. As he walked away, Agnes went inside. She picked up the small, smooth stone that had sat on her hearth all winter. She walked to the edge of her clearing and looked down the path he was taking, the path back to the life she had left behind. She thought about throwing it, about casting the last piece of that old life away. But she did not. She walked back to her own hearth, the one she had built with her own 2 hands, and placed the stone in its center. It belonged here now. It was not a memory of a home she had lost. It was the foundation stone of a home she had made. The sun was warm on her back. A bird sang a single, clear note from a budding aspen. Inside the shelter, Tinder was asleep in a patch of sunlight, purring. The world was beginning again.